Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Within the world of commerce, we all know that companies exist quite simply in order to make a profit. I mean, that statement, as obvious and emotionless as it may be, is fact. What is interesting to consider, however, is how certain products, through their own quality, likability, and a host of other factors, break through and come to represent more. They enter our consciousness symbolic of something deeper, something more than just a money-making means to an end. I mean, some products even cross over into the realm of pop culture, where they become somewhat ubiquitous in the scope of life and living beyond just their utility-based value. I mean, consider a pair of Nikes, Ray-Bans, or even an iPhone. I mean, these products have arguably nestled into a rarefied air as being commonly considered part of our collective cultural existence. What is even more fascinating is how some of these brands have sustained this status across multiple consumer lifetimes in multiple countries and across multiple cultures. Well, on today's show, we have the opportunity to discuss one such brand product with an individual eminently qualified to talk on such matters. Welcome to the show. So, Paul Kraft is the Japan country manager for Haribo, a German confectionery company that famously gave the world the gift of gummy bears, or gold bears, as officially labeled. Now, originally from Minnesota in the US, Paul began his career in brand management, working with frozen pizza and dessert categories, consumer insights, and M&A roles. He then relocated to Japan, where he headed the packaged good business for Starbucks in Japan and Korea. After launching honey baked ham within the Japanese market and a post at Nestle Nespresso, he joined the German confectionery company Haribo to lead their Japan expansion, and most recently drove the Gold Bear brand to the #1 market share position. Now, Paul holds a master's in international management along with a BA in finance and economics, both from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. As the chair of the Food and Agriculture Committee of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, Paul frequently consults and speaks on tailoring foreign brands for Japan. He, his Japanese wife, and their 2 children currently live in Tokyo. With all that stated, Paul, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the program. How are you doing?
Good, Christopher. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to have this talk. Going through it ahead of time here, I think we're primed for a nice little chat. So
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, likewise. Well, why don't we just jump right into it? I have the first segment lined up. It's something called Coloring Wikipedia. As my listeners know, it's a segment where I just sort of read off a definition of the guest profession or sometimes their industry based on what Wikipedia spits out. But unfortunately, bit of bad news. Wikipedia is letting us down a little bit here, Paul. They didn't actually have an entry for country manager.
Oh,
surprising.
No.
Yeah,
Terrible.
A little bit surprising. I know. But I did a little bit of internet sleuthing, and a site called betterteam.com is going to fill in for us today. And let me just read off that definition from that site for country manager. Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
All right, here we go. Country manager. Country managers represent their company in a foreign country. Country managers work within growing industries experiencing global expansion. They manage all operations in a particular region, including recruitment, budgets, planning, and submitting reports. Country managers might also require specialized skill sets in industry-related knowledge. So there you go, a bit general, but it covers a lot in there. What do you think, first take?
Well, submitting reports, that was interesting that
that one stands out for you.
We all feel like that from time to time. Overall, I mean, it is pretty broad, but depending on the country, the size of the company, the industry, it's very, very different.
Right.
Someone who leads AIG insurance company, a multi-billion-dollar outfit here in Japan. That's a very different job than Haribo gummy bears, of course. But it's accurate.
Okay. Is there anything missing or anything you'd like to add, perhaps?
I think
in terms of, I guess, maybe your work and what the industry you're within.
Sure. I think that I've been thinking about this and talking to a few people, and the highest number of country managers are probably country managers of firms that have 30 or fewer people. mean, yes, there's huge high profile country managers out there, but they're the exception rather than the norm. So I think I sort of think about that smaller size, if you will. Okay. So even large companies might have, 10 people here. Yeah. So, thinking of that most, country manager posts are within offices or within groups that have a small number of people. Yeah. I would say that, there's a lot of, being the jack of all trades, master of none, you're sweeping
wearing a lot of different hats.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, for me, that's one of the reasons why I've enjoyed it. But I think in general, and I'm speaking from Japan here, but in general, that's what it is. So I might color that one a little different.
Sure. Well, in terms of that, I guess, and wearing a lot of different hats, what would be like a typical week for you, I guess, or even a typical day, if you could even envision or break that down for us?
Mm-hmm. So for me, the Haribo is in Japan. We're selling. We are in almost we're in 75% of the stores in Japan, and so a lot of that is managing the day-to-day business, whether that be sales, inventory, budgets, submitting reports as it says. But I think the thing I enjoy is, again, it might not be a typical week, but a typical month might have me, visiting a factory, or going to a large retailer like Costco or Family Mart, which are two of the largest convenience store chains in the world, located here in Japan. Or sometimes things get a little exciting that you get to go to an embassy. Because of where for a party or whatever, perhaps where you're working, that's always fun. Or you might go to the post office. Christopher, I mean, it's a whole, or might take out your own recycling. So it's definitely a wide variety.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, in terms of that, a lot of the guests I've had on this program, that wider that variance, though, the more fulfilling the work becomes, I find. Mm-hmm. Stressful at times, of course, no doubt, no doubt. But but I also say, though, too, I think that like that variety does help quite a bit. And it's a point that's often overlooked. I think a lot of people just sort of assume right away that equals stress, that equals pressure. Well, yes, it can, but it can also equal a lot of other things too, fulfillment being one of them. So.
Right. And it's for me, it's interesting. Yeah. It's like, a container is stuck going through, food inspection or quarantine for what reason? Yeah. It's, sometimes if it is stressful, but if you can sort of treat it as an adventure.
Yeah. I just had another guest on recently, and she's a professor, and she's within chemistry, and she teaches at one of the big universities in the States. And one of her ways of kind of interpreting things, problems, she doesn't use the word problems anymore with her students or anything she encounters in her daily life. It's like puzzles. It's like puzzling these things out, and it just puts a whole different spin on it, which allows her to kind of find some joy in the moment that otherwise could be really difficult to get through. And I think
right. Or at least to say it's a puzzle, not a disaster.
Yeah, exactly.
Which sometimes things feels like. But
no, totally. Cool. So that reframing. Okay. Well, I think that's kind of painting a a nice picture for us and for listeners to kind of get a good idea here. Maybe you could meander into another segment here, something called Pathways. And my listeners might be familiar with this, although I did launch it in the last month or so. It's a newer segment. But basically, it's put in there to kind of acknowledge that we as professionals, or anyone in particular, where we end up is never, or very rarely, this straight line from, say, youth. Like, okay, one day I want to be a country manager. One day I want to be this. There's oftentimes a lot of zigging and zagging, left turns, right turns, so on and so forth. Now, off the top, in terms of, introducing you, I mentioned some of the things that you've been involved with along the way, but I think it'd be interesting to hear it from you in particular. Like, how did you end up, starting out in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Tokyo, and, the zigging, zagging for you along the way?
Right. Well, I think I'm a child of the 80s, and when I tell my story, that'll, probably become clear. But, I am from a smaller town in Minnesota. Minnesota is sometimes called Southern Canada.
That's right.
But I did various part-time jobs, and I was lucky enough to work as a bank teller. And I thought, back then, working in a bank and being in finance, that would be great. And so I chose to double major in finance and economics, and I chose my college that specialized in that. And then I realized that I didn't enjoy that. I enjoyed parts of it, but what I mostly enjoyed was having a wide view of all parts of business.
Yeah.
Sure, everyone seems to love marketing, or everyone, that's how you and I first met.
Yeah.
But to have talk about supply chain, and talk about finance, to talk about customers, to talk about learning about consumers, and et cetera. It's like we were talking about. It's a puzzle, and I found it very, very interesting. So I stuck with finance, but just knew that wasn't my life's calling. But I became also, back to referring to the 80s, that this was the peak of the Japan bubble era. And Japan Inc. owned Pebble Beach and Rockefeller Center and Columbia Pictures, and Toyota was taking over, and you better speak Japanese because you're going to be working for them someday, right?
Yeah.
And so that got me interested in Japan, because I think that's where the world was going, and in a way it did. And came here for the first time as a college student, thought it was awesome, and ended up kind of going back and forth, and being involved in Japan most of my career now. But that's it. But I think, as far as sort of taking it full circle back to being a country manager, you talked about, I started off in brand management, and really the brand or product management. And product management now, traditionally was like a product sold in a grocery store, but now it can be anything. But that gave me that wide viewpoint, wide view atop all of these things, from forecasting to the things we've been talking about. And I'll never forget one of my first experiences, in the States. Frozen pizza is a big deal, right? Especially, in the Midwest where I'm from. And, when the American football, the Super Bowl comes in January, forecasting frozen pizza is a trick during the Super Bowl, during the football season.
I bet.
So that was really interesting, and that kind of got me on my way.
Yeah. I think one thing that sort of stood out when you were just explaining a lot of that was this notion of learning and almost like curiosity towards it all. Not being stuck just within finance, having that wide view, as you were referring to, being able to get your hands dirty in a few different areas and just learn, probably, and just being curious about it, constantly sort of pushing yourself and finding. Right. I'm sure there is a connection there in terms of some of the people that go on to live and start careers or sustain careers internationally. That's also part of that whole life and living thing as well. Outside the professional sphere, it's just like your everyday life. You're still learning every day. I mean,
or, for me, there's always, we all know a lot about many parts of our careers and our jobs, but there's, I'm almost always beholden to somebody more of an expert than I am.
Yeah.
In a particular field or topic, but that's interesting, because it's how do you track 400 containers going around the world, so they don't get stuck. That's interesting.
Yeah, totally. No, I can totally see that. Maybe we can jump over into a new segment here, a Q&A discovery. We can kind of just continue this back and forth. And this first question I have here, I mean, again, in speaking of some of your experiences, you've been professionally involved with managing these major global brands, obviously Starbucks, Nestle Espresso, Honey Baked Ham, and now, of course, Haribo. What have been some of your biggest challenges in terms of doing this? I mean, you've been charged with not only managing the brands, but managing these teams that are responsible for keeping these brands not only afloat, but quite successful. And of course, you've been doing this in markets that are far, far different than the one that you grew up within, in North America. What have been some of the biggest challenges that you've faced along the way?
I know you have, guests from all over. So I specifically talk about, Japan, and have focused my career here. Yeah. But I mean, Japan and the rest of the world are really different.
Yeah.
And the
That's an understatement, but yeah.
the way that people think, the way that people prioritize, the way that people run meetings, the way decisions are made is amazing.
Mm.
And it's amazingly different. And some of the challenges are always get someone in the room from Japanese team and the American team, and sometimes they're completely on different pages.
Yeah.
And yet they think the other is understanding and is agreeing, and they're not. So, ultimately, and it seems a bit trite, Christopher, but boy, communication in any language, not only the language, but in the history, in the culture is, I'm not a cultural expert, or, I speak Japanese, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, you can't do anything if you can't communicate.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest challenge is always getting both, I'll call it, sides of the table aligned on what we've decided, what the next steps are, what is a priority, what is not a priority. That's the big one.
Yeah, most definitely. That's a good point. I mean, it's not just the language itself within the communication, it's everything else. It's the culture attached to that as well. So, for example, nonverbal gestures, or, like misinterpreting some of those can send things off in the wrong direction, and
right.
It's understanding some of the reasoning behind those elements of the culture as well. It's having this really full, deep understanding, and having parties, I suppose, that are willing to go to those lengths. I would assume, at least, from my experience living here too, of wanting to try to find that middle ground and truly understand one another.
Right. And not necessarily, we don't have to agree. This people don't have to agree, but they need to understand that they're not agreeing.
Yeah.
Sometimes. So yeah, I mean, it sounds very convoluted, perhaps, the way I'm talking about it, but I've seen, living here in Japan, that can be quite sometimes bizarre.
Yeah.
So what people get out of, or what people hear.
Yeah. But what would have been some of your workarounds in terms of that, I guess? I mean, that being one of the biggest challenges. How have you tried to circumvent those issues?
Well, I think I have always, and maybe we're jumping ahead, but I've always said, like, I'm on the Japan team. I'm not on the Haribo team. I'm not on the Starbucks team. I'm here to be between the parties. I represent Japan, and sometimes I'll agree with party A, and sometimes I might disagree, but I represent Japan. So that gives me license to interrupt a meeting and say, whoa, you're saying this, and you're saying this, and this doesn't match. And then people are like, you're right, Paul. I didn't say that, and I didn't mean to communicate that. So I guess I just try to sort of lay the groundwork of my role, and then in a meeting or email or something, really sort of jump in when I see, almost with not a red flag maybe, but a yellow flag, saying that people aren't on the same page.
How prevalent has it been, maybe not necessarily within Haribo, but across your career to this point, like cultural trainings, like internally between, like, on both sides, perhaps?
How much cultural training have I?
Have the teams that you've been part of?
I mean, I think there's sort of the normal, first 2 years you're in Japan.
Yeah.
The whole, when someone says hi, or they say yes, that doesn't mean they agree. That means that they listen. So I think after the first 2 years of sort of the basic stuff.
Yeah.
But then it's just experience and experience and experience.
Yeah.
And
I guess I was kind of getting at it here as well, aside from just yourself per se, but like just internally with your teams, are there like fairly regular sort of trainings on this, or is it something that's spoken about on either side, on the US side? Perhaps?
The way I've seen it, I've tried to handle it, and the way I've seen it handled, probably the most successful, is not necessarily from a cultural standpoint, because sometimes that's the easy one, but it's more like, okay, let's the cultural side, let's brush that aside. We are all different. Some of us are introverts, some of us are extroverts, some of us are process driven, some of us are people driven, some of us, prefer communicating by email. Some people prefer going out for a drink after work.
Right.
And I think after some of the initial cultural stuff, depending on who I'm working with, focusing on just that type
Okay.
that's been very successful. When people are coming from different cultures, that has been even more powerful.
That's really interesting. Okay. Well, I do have another question here. Getting back to your present day role with Haribo, I mean, managing this 100-plus-year-old brand. That again,
I'm not doing it myself, but yes.
well, you're playing a large role, for one country in particular. But and I mentioned off the top, I mean, it has kind of taken its place into pop culture now with this Gold Bear product, obviously gummy bears. But it does have a rather short history in Japan. And I did also note off the top that you've had some success here, some great success, in fact, of driving the Gold Bear brand to the #1 market share position in Japan. I'd love to know about, what drove some of that massive success outside of maybe some of the things we've already discussed.
Okay. Well, first of all, I thank you for doing your research. Haribo actually has been in Japan for a little over 30 years.
Okay. All right.
So, as a European product, there's called Plaza now, but it used to be called Sony Plaza, which you can think of as an import grocery store where people would buy imported candy and products and things like that. So Haribo has actually been in Japan for many years. So there is a base of, say, women from their but people in their 40s younger who heard of Haribo. Anyway, 5 years ago, before I joined, the company was really at a crossroads in Japan. Is it going to be an import market? People order, we sell, they sticker it, we sell it, or is the company have confidence or feels that there's a chance to go into the mass market to compete side by side, literally against the local players? And this is tough. I mean, if you go into a convenience store today in Japan, you say, I want to find foreign brand. You'll find Kit Kat from Nestle, but that's Japanese. They've been here forever. Now, the global Kit Kat Japan actually influenced the global Kit Kat strategy globally. But there's very few. You don't find M&Ms very much anymore. Snickers, not really. So, I mean, there's very, very few. So the fact that, we had a toehold was very, very encouraging. One of the reasons my interest was piqued. But, it's really, we could talk about the details if you'd like, but it's really going in and saying, okay, here's what consumers are looking for. And we are missing the mark on many boxes in the checklist. So are we going to make those changes and go for it or not? And, we had the data, and the headquarters believed in us, and we went for it. And I will say Haribo, I do want to correct you if I may, Christopher. Haribo, the Gold Bear product, the 80-gram product, is the #1 SKU, the #1 single gummy bear product in Japan. We are not the #1 brand, but it's a tight race between first, second, and third. And today we're third, but check back in a year.
I like that. Okay. All right.
Did I answer your questions?
Yeah. I mean, could you give an example of one of those decisions that might have been tough, like in particular of.
Yeah, we had a scary one.
Several, but.
We had a scary one. We did several things to the package to communicate better, and I can get into that. But the real scary one was going from, we were at a price point, we're 100 grams for 239 yen.
Okay.
And we decided to go on to 80 grams at 179 yen. And that doesn't seem scary, but when retailers say, well, the break even on that is you have to sell 19% more packages for us to make the same amount of money.
Yeah, that's
and we don't think you can do that. It's like, oof.
Ooh.
Okay, well, we think we can, and we had all the data to back it up. But that was, if I could think of one decision, that was,
it was a big one.
We were confident, but there was a lot of skepticism.
Well, congratulations on that. I mean, that's
quite
the feat. And I guess, I stand corrected, as you said, you've been in the market. It's been in the market for 30 years, I suppose. It's a 100-plus-year-old brand. So I guess,
yes,
certainly a decent amount of time it's been here. But to bring it up to that position, where and achieve that level of success in in a rather short amount of time since you've been part of running the operations there in Japan is hats off to you on that.
So, no, thank you. Well, there's many people around the world helping out. So, but yes, course, it's been fun.
All right, well, maybe we'd skip on and do another question here. Getting back to you, I guess. I mean, it's one thing to be successful in your career, I think, domestically. It's another to be successful in a foreign market. And I think it's on a whole different level when you've been doing this, identified a few times over by multiple brands to lead Starbucks, Nestle, Nespresso, Honey Baked Ham, a few different companies there. In looking back at some of your achievements, what would you say has been driving a lot of that in terms of maybe skills, mindset, or anything else that's fueled your career to this point?
Yeah, well, I've touched on already. We talked about the jack of all trades and, knowing that in most meetings, I'm not the expert, being curious, when to listen. I think the other is your question more about Japan specifically or just?
Well, you can answer it either way. I mean,
okay, maybe this is probably applies more to just to Japan, but people, they're in a foreign country, they're dealing with a foreign culture, and they want to be respectful, and maybe they're a little nervous, and they feel like a guest or whatever, and that's right. But there are also times when you say, well, we're a Western company, we're an American company, we're a German company, so we look at it this way, and we want to talk about it in this fashion, and so to know when to sort of honor the local customs, but when also to say, hey, look, let's try to fast forward through some of this stuff and cut to the chase. That would be one. I think another one is I talked about being upfront about being on Team Japan, but the other one is, I don't know if it's, I think we were joking before we started, but I don't know if it's being quote unquote resilient or patient or being stubborn. I don't know. Sometimes those kind of the lines blur. But I think to if you believe in something, let people prove you wrong first versus say, oh, we don't do that.
I think it's interesting at times where some people can get frustrated by the market, say here within Japan, because it is so different at times, and trying to decipher and understand it, and even spending the amount of time that you've probably been here or that I've been here nearly 20 years now. You think you've got a handle on it at times, and other, in certain moments or certain instances, you're like, you still don't fully grasp like why or what's going on here. You think you understand it all, but you don't. I mean, it's that deep of a culture, I think, at times. And it's easy to get sort of frustrated by that. But also, too, I think if you can step back and have that bigger picture, you can sort of, like you were just speaking of, you can use some of this knowledge to your advantage, like you are, say, for example, representing a foreign country or foreign company, taking advantage of that at times in terms of like, well, we understand this is how you do things, but we think that there could be an opportunity here. If all the rest of the competition is doing things this particular way, there might be wiggle room to kind of do something different and make up some, to gain a competitive advantage at times. And like, you can choose those two pathways. One, just getting frustrated and just throwing your arms up in the air and like, or you can kind of step
and believe
back
me,
and
I've done that sometimes too.
Yeah, I'm sure we all have, most definitely. But it's like moments where you can kind of catch yourself before you do that, I suppose, and realize that there's a little bit of wiggle room here that like we could actually gain a competitive advantage if we do kind of push the boundaries a little bit here. And I was kind of picking up on that vibe of what you're saying, and I'm assuming that's kind of where you're going at.
Yeah, or I mean, we're not Japanese. We don't look Japanese. I speak Japanese, but it's quite clear I'm not native. But that also gives us sort of permission to break the rules. And in many Asian cultures, not just Japan, saving face it can be a big issue when you're trying to do things differently. And by being a foreigner, you can enable companies or groups or projects to take some risks, and because you're a foreigner, that helps save the face of maybe your Japanese partners or your Asian partners. So, to sort of really have your antennas up on, all of your options to go forward is important.
It's critical. Yeah. Well, I do have one last question in the segment here. And again, returning to you, I mean, you spent a significant portion of your career here within Japan. And I'd love to know, what's been the allure or the staying power for you of this market? What's kept you here this long?
Well, depending on the day. But no, I think you mentioned at the beginning, I have 2 children. It's a great place to raise children. Good healthcare, safe, great food. People are nice, good schools. It's very, very, nice place to live. Yeah. I think, again, I'm from a smaller town in southern Minnesota originally, and very proud to be from there. But Tokyo is global city,
Right.
but by that I mean, on occasion I would have the opportunity to meet the ambassadors or somewhat famous people or extremely interesting people from around the world.
Right.
That are either they're just very creative, or they're just interesting in their own right, or they're at their top of their game because of this is Tokyo, right? So it is very interesting, fascinating, and fulfilling to be a part of it.
Every day is a little bit different, isn't it? That's at least what I found as well from living in Japan for this amount of time. It's just
yeah.
Like I said, you think you got things figured out, but you never do, and that's the beauty of it.
Well, there's that, but I maybe it's kind of a joke. I was telling someone, 2 ambassadors ago, from the United States was Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of John F. Kennedy, and I met her, had the opportunity to meet her twice, and I was like, her dad was on a coin, the 50 cent piece, right? Like her dad was on a coin. That's pretty cool. If you think about just the arc of history, it's very interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting opportunities certainly arise.
Yes.
City, no doubt. Alrighty. Well, maybe we could shift out over into this middle segment here, a water cooler story segment. As my listeners know, it's a segment where I just ask guests to indulge listeners with a story related to their profession, and anything in particular that they'd that you'd like to share. I'd be really interested to hear what you have for us today.
Yeah. Well, I think I've been thinking about this a little bit. You told me that this question was coming, so I was reflecting back, and you did mention honey baked ham, and for your listeners who are not American, honey baked ham is a 400 store chain in the United States, very large, again, family owned. But I had the opportunity to launch honey baked ham in Japan.
Yeah,
and there was some things there that I didn't really realize I would enjoy or get satisfaction out of until I was actually inside of it. And I think, I know you're from Canada. We both have mutual friends from all over, but I think there's something really quite patriotic, right, about importing American pork from the heartland and selling it. And the embassies are involved, and export commissions are involved, and I just, there's a sort of a little bit of patriotism there, if you will, that you're, helping find markets for people back, quote unquote, back home. And I really enjoyed it. And I mentioned that maybe the ending of my story is maybe more personal, but I'm from southern Minnesota, and we had honey baked ham had a cafe, a shop, and I was working there, and I knew a contingency was in town of pork producers.
Okay.
From Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska. And then I was, doing my thing, trying to run my small business. And a gentleman came in. I could tell he was American. And I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Laverne, Minnesota." I said, "My grandmother grew up in Worthington." And that was 30 miles away.
Yeah.
And so to meet somebody like that,
right,
in Tokyo, is amazing. Anyway, that's my water cooler story.
Nice. Yeah. It's an interesting sort of twist to it. Like, I mean, you can kind of take it like that nuts and bolts sort of like analysis of it. You're just bringing in a brand into the market, blah, 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 blah.
You're right.
But it's that extra, story or extra twist to it there. But like, I can totally see that where like, you do have pride, for your own country, obviously, and for the region that you're from.
We all do. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It's just, I think it's human nature. Right. And being involved in something like that and having all these different parties and groups, helping to support that, the embassies and all these other people who, as well, associations perhaps too,
Right.
Yeah, I can see how you could get swept up in that. It becomes more than just like a business, this cold sort of sterile sort of.
Yeah. And
there's more to it.
Yeah, well, exactly. I didn't ever serve in the military or anything like that. And I sometimes wish I did, but it was sort of my, some days I felt like I was at least doing my part, help, on that. So I enjoyed it. I really, I didn't see that coming. But I really enjoyed it.
It's not an angle that I ever would have really considered either. But when it's, you map it out like that, it makes complete sense though. So
right.
It's a really interesting angle. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're breezing through all of this. We're heading into the very last segment here, an actual crystal.
I can talk. I can talk more.
Well, here we go. Let's set this one up here. Crystal ball segment, as the name implies, we're looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And again, while researching for this talk, I went to the global brand site for Haribo, of course, the Japanese one as well. And one thing that struck me right away from the global brand site for the Gold Bear brand in particular, right on the feature page had nutritional information about the product. And I mean, it didn't surprise me because I think we're all aware that we're moving into this age of health and wellness and nutrition and all these different things, like for obvious reasons. A lot of the Western markets, obesity rates are just skyrocketing. So it wasn't a shock, but at the same time, like it was a recognition of like, the times have changed, right? I mean, this would not be on the front page of an ad for a confectionery company 20 years ago, let alone even 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago.
Right.
So I just found it interesting in that sense. And then also too, like I was thinking if I or anyone were in charge of a brand that's within, this industry, it must be a bit of a challenge, like obviously, like you can see the reasons why these things are being put out there and why governments are sometimes mandating this information be put out there. But I thought it'd be interesting to hear it from somebody like yourself. I mean, it's almost like if you're doing a SWOT analysis, this is almost like a bit of a threat in a sense to a business like yours,
Right.
It's interesting anyway. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I can't speak to Haribo, specifically.
No.
We have,
general,
we have departments for that who in Germany who, can speak more eloquently than I can. But I can tell you that if we're talking about, obesity or health or, what's in our food, I think that in my experience, and this even goes back to, I mentioned frozen pizza earlier, but people, if it's coffee or pizza or ice cream or gummy bears, or I'm sure chocolate, if they're going to have it, they want to have the good stuff. I mean, they want to, not necessarily the good stuff, but I'm talking about indulgent categories, if you will. So, low calorie, half calorie, low fat frozen pizza. Nope. People are not interested. When I want pizza, I want pizza. So, so even if companies have tried to do something different, that necessarily hasn't worked. On the flip side, you mentioned some people call it honesty in packaging, or making sure you're communicating, you're not trying to deceive, or in the industry, people call it a clean label. Okay. So, ingredients that are easier to read or pronounce or understand. In Japan, it's been, in other markets too, but in Japan, smaller pack sizes is very important. So we have, a regular bag would be like, 80 grams, if you will, or, sometimes half a pound or just under. But, the Japanese prefer, and other markets now too, prefer smaller sizes or mini bags. So it's portion control. So another example from this is from the States. It's nothing new, but 100-calorie pack. So I know I can eat this whole thing, it's a little bag, but a little bag of cookies that I'm not like consuming 1,000 calories. It's only 100. So there's quite a few things, there that are probably higher on the priority list for consumers in the indulgent categories. That we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess it comes down to some of those strategic sort of decisions and finding out, like truly understanding what your consumer wants are. They're not going to give up the products necessarily. They just want to, maybe change perhaps the way they consume them, or at least like how they feel when they're consuming them. So smaller packages, I guess, would be one way around that. Right.
Okay. They feel like they're more in control.
Yeah.
Because, I can polish off majority of a pizza, no problem.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there other Yeah, other ways, I suppose, that some of these confectionery companies, not Haribo in particular, but from being part of this industry for a little while now, that you're seeing any trends, like other things or other ways or workarounds that they're trying to.
Yeah. Well, packaging is a big thing. So what, unfortunately, plastic is very difficult to get away from, but people are doing it with different, paper coatings or making it more recyclable.
Mm-hmm.
Or, part of it is, something might be recyclable.
Yeah.
Starbucks had this issue. Everyone criticized them for cups. We say like, well, they're recyclable. Well, in the United States anyway, each county or each major metropolitan area would have different standards of recycling. So there's sort of, chaos isn't the right word, but there's sort of mismatches around the system. So packaging is a big one, or have even lessening packaging, having less plastic, less packaging. That's key. I talked about cleaner labeling, and the other would be, you see, the phrase guilt-free. Oh, this is guilt-free.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Maybe a little marketing hocus pocus there. But but that's what people are going for. If it can be guilt-free, maybe because it has some functionality, maybe vitamins are added, or now we see quite a bit of either innovation, new product activity around things like protein bars, or sports bars or things like this. Now some of these do taste like a candy bar, but it is less guilty, and most of the time they are, better for you or have some sort of benefit. Yeah, I think finally just looking at confectionery, but not just confectionery, but fair trade and making sure the farmers, similar to coffee farmers, but cocoa farmers around the world are treated sustainably and fairly, and that's also a big thing, especially for the chocolate side of the business. So yeah, those are some things that come.
Well, I think like for somebody like myself who's on the outside looking in at all this, it makes complete sense to hear it like this way, as you spell it out. But it's not things that you would necessarily consider, and I think listeners will really appreciate sort of just learning about that. I think a lot of the people who listen to this show are curious minded, and and
it's not just confectionery, but it's food, and some of the studies about what we eat and the packaging and things like that. We're learning. We're smart about this stuff.
And that's a whole different area that we didn't get into today, and maybe some other time. But in terms of like the packaging and the environmental issues and whatnot, and how that's evolving, like that's really fascinating to see how that's unfolding as well across a spectrum of industries. But
the last part of this is, for me, I always think about, because some people would say, oh, big companies, big brand, whatever, they're evil, but also they have a lot to protect. And, with the Twitter and the TikToks and the Instagrams of the world, it doesn't take much to get bad news, to get people to know that maybe your product is unsafe or not good for you or whatever. So, big brands and big companies, in this day and age, they need to protect that.
Yeah.
And so that sometimes having a big brand causes people to do more good.
It keeps them on their toes, right?
For sure. So I think that's another sort of interesting development, and you've seen other larger companies make strides because of it.
That's a good point. It's probably a nice one to finish off the conversation on. We've blown through this.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, it's been a lot of fun. I thank you immensely for sharing all of your insights. So
my pleasure.
Thanks again. Well, for those interested in learning more about Paul and his work, you can check him out on LinkedIn. Of course, you can go over to Haribo. For reference, the links for those sites will be in the show notes. And of course, if you like today's show, you can, share. I mean, that goes a long ways in terms of putting information out to others. And to show further support, you can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And lastly, head on over to YouTube. In the last year, I did launch a channel over there. I will have some imagery associated with the talk, and you can kind of take it in a different manner. And then finally, don't forget to tune into the next episode of Life as where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.